Hi everybody and welcome to this webinar. Today we're looking at the changes to the 2023-2024 apprenticeship funding rules, and this webinar is aimed at employers. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team within the Apprenticeship Service, and I'll be looking after you today and hosting the session. And I'm joined by colleagues from our Apprenticeship Funding Policy team. And they're the ones that are going to be taking you through the main funding rule changes. So you'll hear from Laura Orritt-Hopkins, Karen Clark and Kate McDonough, and they'll also be joined by a number of other colleagues. We've got Faisal Ahmed, Ambrish Patel and Aisha Suleiman, who are going to pitch in on the Q&A panel as well. So welcome to all of you guys. We're going to run for about 60 minutes or so today. And Laura and Karen and Kate will run through the key changes. Then we'll have sort of a 10-15 minute Q&A session, and then I'll round up the session with some details about the additional support that's available to you. And as usual, we won't go through into questions that don't relate to today's topic, or if your question is really specific about a particular circumstance, in that case, what we'd recommend is that you contact the support desk to go through the queries with them, because they'll be able to spend more time understanding what the nature of the query. And I'll share the contact details of the support desk a little bit later on during the session. We're expecting there's going to be quite a few questions that are asked today, and we'll try and get through obviously as many as we can. We'll theme some of them together where they're similar, so that the panel don't have to answer the same questions over and again. But if we don't manage to cover everything, and the likelihood is probably we won't cover everything that we get in, what we'll do is we'll take a commitment to take those questions away, and we'll come back to everybody on the call and email you some responses to the main themes raised from the questions that we don't get to cover. Okay, so I'm handing over to Laura first of all, and she'll take us through the first part of today's input. So Laura, can I just check that you're there?
Hi Nick, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, got you loud and clear.
Great, thank you. So hello everybody. As Nick said, my name is Laura Orritt-Hopkins and I'm one of the senior managers on the Apprenticeship Funding Policy team at DFE. So I have responsibility for the overall production and publication of the apprenticeships funding rules, as well as some of the actual policy areas. So we're going to be using this session to talk through some of the key changes to the 23-24 rules. We published the initial version of the rules on the 31st of March. That was in order to highlight the proposed changes and give the sector and stakeholders the opportunity to provide us with feedback on any areas that seem unclear, ambiguous or problematic. The feedback mailbox closed on the 28th of April, which meant there was a 4-week period for people to provide us with their feedback. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank anybody on the call who did take the time to send us feedback. That's now all being reviewed, and where appropriate, changes were made for version 1 of the rules, which we published on the 12th of May. So the main changes for 23-24 are outlined in the summary of changes document, which we always produce alongside a new set of funding rules. You can find that on gov.uk. So in terms of the format of this year's webinars, we're going to follow what we did last year. So really, instead of going through the summary of changes in detail, we're going to focus on the key issues and the changes to provide more context around the rationale for the changes and any further changes that we made as a result of your feedback. So this does mean, though, that this webinar will not cover every single change, and therefore we would strongly recommend that you refer to the summary of changes and full funding rules documents if you haven't already done so. Before we get into the detail of the changes, I wanted to say something about the context to the rules for 23-24, and this has been one of simplification. Simplification isn't just specific to the funding rules, but it's an overall commitment to make it easier for employers and providers to support high quality apprenticeships. And the funding rules form one of a number of work strands for simplification. In our review of the funding rules for 23-24, we spoke with a range of stakeholders to get their views on barriers and issues with the rules. So these stakeholders included AOC, ALP, UVAC, a number of employer providers. And as part of this feedback, we also asked for potential resolutions to these issues. In parallel, our team undertook a line-by-line review of each section of the rules. So we removed, simplified and restructured wherever possible, whilst retaining rules that are key. So this work therefore resulted in a significant number of changes to our approach to the rules for 23-24. As well as the rules changes that we'll talk about shortly, there are also a number of presentational changes that we've made this year, and these are all intended to simplify the rules and make things easier for both employers and providers. One of the key pieces of feedback that we received was around earlier publication of the rules, and that's really in order to give stakeholders more time to plan and then implement any changes required in their systems and processes. We therefore published the initial version of the rules on the 31st of March, which is 4 months before the start of the funding year and 2 months earlier than we did last year. And this was followed by version 1, as I said before, which we published on the 12th of May. You may recall that in previous years, we had 3 separate rules documents, one for providers, one for employers, and one for employer providers. But stakeholders told us that having these 3 different documents added complexity and also created duplication in content. So we've therefore this year brought the 3 documents into one single document, whilst ensuring that the responsibilities of each party remain clear. In combining the 3 documents, we undertook a line-by-line review of the rules. We removed unnecessary content and we restructured a number of the sections. So this review has contributed to a reduction in the word count of almost 30% compared to the previous main provider rules document, which is the one we did the comparison. It's probably worth me saying that to make the rules more accessible for readers, there is more white space within the document. So while the number of pages may not have reduced, the word count has significantly. Finally, then, we reviewed all of the evidence requirements and included the relevant evidence requirements at the end of each section, rather than having a huge list at the end that we did previously. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Karen, who will start to go through the policy changes.
Thanks, Laura. Hi everyone. So like Laura, I'm one of the senior managers on the apprenticeship funding policy team at DFE, and I'm going to go through some of the areas that I lead on in the funding rules. So starting with initial assessment. So Laura's just mentioned that we undertook a line-by-line review of the funding rules as part of the simplification project, and in doing that we moved some areas of the rules around and grouped them together in a slightly different way. And this is one example. So in this part of the rules where we talk about initial assessment, so that's where your provider will assess the eligibility of the learner and the programme, we moved everything that was relevant for that assessment together, so it was all at the front of the document. So in that section, we now have all of the information and rules about learner eligibility, programme eligibility, learning support in English and maths all together. Then towards the end of that section, there are the funding rules that relate to what needs to happen after the assessment exercise is complete. So this is where we talk about the outcome of the initial assessment. And when we were working on that part of the rules for 23-24, as Laura said, we were engaging a lot with feedback and with stakeholder bodies. And what they were saying was that it was often difficult to get you guys, to get employers sometimes looped into these conversations, especially on a face-to-face basis, because obviously everyone's really busy. And the question from providers was really, what could we do to mitigate or simplify that? Now, we didn't want to drop the requirement for an employer to be involved in that conversation, because it's really important for you to have an understanding of the process and how the results of the initial assessment of your potential apprentice will inform their training plan. but we took on board the concerns that were raised and we made some changes. So first, there was a little bit of a language change when we talk about the outcome. Previously, we talked about the conversation as being a meeting, and it's often been implied that the discussion is a face-to-face one. But for 23-24, we changed these references to discussion, and we clarified that these discussions could also be virtual or via email. Second, we said that if you as the employer were unable to attend the discussion, even one that was virtual or via email, the provider had to do two things. So they had to give you the opportunity to contribute towards the outcome meeting. So anything you wanted to contribute, they had to obviously tell you when the meeting was happening and give you the opportunity to feed into that. And then second, they had to send you the relevant information afterwards for your review and signature. And the purpose of that was really to allow a degree of flexibility for providers to have those meetings and to, you know, get all of the onboarding done so your apprentice could start, but still keeping you as the employer in the loop. We made a few other changes in that section. So we moved the requirement to discuss roles and responsibilities into this section. Now, this wasn't new text, so the requirement to discuss the roles and responsibilities of the three parties, the provider, the employer, and the learner, has always been in the funding rules, but it was previously a little bit further on in the document. It was in the training plan section. The reason we moved it forward, so it was right at the beginning, was because we'd had some feedback from employers who indicated that they didn't always know or understand the extent of what they were required to do with their apprentice, especially the time commitment in relation to taking part or providing input into progress reviews until after their apprentice had started on the programme. So that's the reason that was brought forward. And we outlined the requirement for an employer to formally commit to those progress reviews as part of the initial assessment conversation. So they were the changes we initially made. And we got a little bit of feedback on this section, not lots. The feedback we did receive mainly centred around language. In some places, we still had a couple of references to it being a meeting rather than a discussion. And so we tightened all that for version 1, so everything was the same. And just to be clear, that discussion can still happen in a face-to-face meeting. So if your provider has a face-to-face meeting with you to discuss the outcome of your apprentice's initial assessment, that's great. We're not suggesting it all has to change and be done via email or anything. What we're suggesting is that we're just putting a little bit more flexibility into the process. The other feedback we had from employers that kind of touches on this area is that, as well as not really understanding their time commitment in relation to progress reviews that they were signing up to, they also didn't understand their commitment in relation to the financial contribution to the apprenticeship until after the programme had started. So we added that into the initial assessment section for version 1, as that conversation with you really needs to happen right up front before the programme begins. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to programme eligibility. For the majority of the programme eligibility section, there weren't a lot of changes. The main changes in this section were in off-the-job training and in progress reviews, and I'm going to come on to those in a moment. Before I go on to those areas, I'll just cover off these 3 areas first. So on apprenticeship agreement, in this section, we outlined the provider's role in checking that the information on the apprenticeship agreement was complete, and this included a check that the agreement had been signed by 2 different people, i.e. the apprentice and the employer. We got very little feedback on this section. There were a couple of comments around the fact that the information fields on the agreement might be complete, but they might not be correct. And there were a couple of questions around who was responsible for amending the agreement if the apprenticeship duration got extended. So we clarified those 2 areas for version 1. Moving on to apprentice wages. In relation to this area, in 23-24, we were really clear in the funding rules that if an employer doesn't pay the apprentice a lawful wage, that individual would be ineligible to receive apprenticeship funding. The feedback we got for this section really centred on the remit of the provider in this space. Many felt that checking whether the employer paying a lawful wage shouldn't really sit with a provider. Longer term, we are trying to establish some data sharing arrangements with HMRC that might mitigate some of these checks that we're asking providers to make, and would almost make these rules redundant, but we're not there yet, so we still do need providers to have a bit of an oversight role there on our behalf. But for version 1, we did make it clearer that your provider is only responsible for checking with you that you're paying a lawful wage whilst the apprentice is on programme. And that evidence from you could be simply a statement that you've signed on the training plan. So if you're happy to sign that you're on the training plan, that you're paying a lawful wage, and you've signed to say that, we wouldn't then hold your provider liable if you weren't doing that. I think that was probably the biggest concern we had in this section from providers. Just moving on to minimum duration. One of the areas we used to get a lot of queries on is about part-time learners. Now, we say in the funding rules that if your apprentice is part-time, their programme has to be extended, sort of pro rata for the hours that they're working. But very often the question we get is, what about if the apprentice is in a position of being able to complete their training in advance of this extended planned learning end date? So in doing the drafting for 23-24, we took the opportunity to make this part of the rules a little bit clearer. We clarified that any apprentice, including those that are part-time, can complete their programme earlier than their planned learning end date, provided the minimum duration and the minimum off-the-job hours that we require for their actual time and learning have been met. The feedback we got on this part of the rules suggested there was still a little bit of confusion around, I suppose the first thing was around why we require the extension in the first place, and then whether the minimum duration we'd made reference to in the initial version of the rules was the statutory minimum of 12 months. So just want to be clear, the reason we say that your provider has to extend a programme for a part-time worker is because as a group, so as a cohort, this group represents a much higher funding risk to us, to the public purse, in relation to the delivery of training and in relation to the potential for them to withdraw. So part-time learners are much more likely to do less training than a full-time learner, for example, and therefore they might take longer to complete their programme, which increases the potential risk of them withdrawing. So to manage those risks, we need to pay for them in a different way to how we pay for full-time learners, which is why we ask for the programme to be extended. And as a result, monthly payments that we make to your provider are lower than what we would make to a full-time learner. But where the programme has been extended and it's been delivered earlier than planned, maybe because your part-time learner has been able to do the same amount of training as a full-time learner, for example, then provide the minimum duration of 12 months and the minimum requirements for off-the-job training have been met, then that programme can finish earlier than that new extended duration. We've hopefully made that much clearer in version 1, the fact that it's a 12-month minimum duration we're talking about. We haven't had a lot of feedback from providers about version 1, so I think that's probably been made a lot clearer now. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to off-the-job training, and this is where we did make a number of changes. So we made one key policy change in this section, and that was to change the frequency around active learning from every 4 weeks to every calendar month. The other updates we made in this section included saying that revision, exams and other testing must not be included as off-the-job training, and that was because in some cases, when we were doing funding audits, we found what looked like a disproportionate amount of off-the-job training being categorised as revision, rather than it being, brand new learning, a new topic that the learner was being exposed to. We also clarified that it was only statutory leave that could be deducted as part of the off-the-job training calculation, and that was even if the apprentice's own annual leave entitlement was higher. And we clarified that because again, at funding audits, we were finding some calculation errors where the person's own annual leave had been included in the calculation. We said that all planned off-the-job training activity had to be agreed in advance of delivery, and that was because again, at funding audits, there didn't appear to be any clear link between the evidence that auditors were being presented with and the training plan. So there was no link really between what should be delivered and what was actually being delivered. There was no way of bringing the two together. And finally, we said it was the provider who was ultimately responsible for all off-the-job training delivery and therefore the associated evidence collection, even if the training was delivered by another party, whether that be you as the employer or the learner was doing something themselves or there was a subcontractor involved in the delivery. It's the person that we're funding who's responsible for everything ultimately. So we did get a lot of feedback from the initial set of funding rules around off-the-job training, and I guess the feedback really kind of fell into the 3 areas that I've got on the slide. So the first of those was revision. I think while most people who fed back accepted the rationale for not including exams or other testing, because that's really a replay of knowledge rather than the person taking something in for the first time. It's kind of replaying what they think they know. People really strongly disagreed with our approach in relation to revision. So we looked at all the comments and the various arguments, and we took all those on board, and on balance we decided to include revision in the list of acceptable off-the-job activities in version 1. I think this is an area we'll probably need to continue to look at, just in terms of any disproportionate volumes of revision. We don't want programmes padded out with lots of revision unless that revision is ultimately needed for the apprenticeship and it's of benefit obviously to the learner. But we do accept that revision can help to embed and reinforce new learning, so it can now be included where it specifically supports the achievement of the programme. The second area of feedback was around the active learning change, and a few people, mainly providers, queried the language change. So previously, when we talked about the active learning rule, when it was based on 4 weeks, the rule said that some active learning must take place every 4 weeks. And in moving the frequency to the calendar month, we softened the language slightly to say that there had to be a plan for active learning to take place every calendar month. Now, clearly we want that plan to materialise into activity. You shouldn't really have a plan unless there's a plan to, deliver it. But we also want to avoid lots of breaks in learning where the programme's paused because something happens which is outside of your provider's control. So for 23-24, we said that if planned off-the-job training was unable to take place as scheduled in any calendar month, a retrospective break in learning wouldn't be required as long as there was active learning in the next calendar month. And I just want to give you an example of what I mean by that. So as an example, let's say there's planned activity in the training plan to happen in January, February, and March. So that means that plan is compliant. But for some reason, the planned activity in February doesn't happen. I mean, maybe the apprentice was sick that day, and that was the only learning activity that had been planned for February, and therefore you've now got a month in the activity of that learner where nothing's been done, no active learning's been done. So what we would require of your providers for them to document the absence, and there should also be evidence that the missed activity has been replanned so that it doesn't obviously get forgotten about. But like I said, that provider is now left with a month where nothing's happened for that learner. Now, if the planned activity went ahead in March, so as was planned, there wouldn't be a need for the provider to put in a break in learning. But if the planned activity in March was also cancelled, so you've now got February and March with nothing happening, then a break in learning would be required. And obviously, of course, if there'd been no plan to begin with for any activity in those 3 months, that would also have required a break in learning. So that's given your provider a little bit more flexibility to cope with circumstances that are outside of their control, like apprentice sickness, for example. The other main area of feedback with this section, so the last bullet point on the slide, was around whether the frequency change to calendar months would be retrospectively applied to current learners, so those people who are already on the apprenticeship programme. I think with this one, I think it's important to say that generally with funding rules, we try not to keep moving the goalposts for activity that's already happened or activity that's already been planned, and especially activity that might already have been audited. But what we have done is a bit of a compromise, is say that the existing 22-23 funding rules in relation to there needing to be activity every 4 weeks, those rules apply up until the 31st of July this year. And then from the 1st of August for the new funding year, the new rules in relation to calendar months can apply both for new starts and for any existing learners. Now, that doesn't mean all training plans have to be changed. Again, that was another question we got as part of the feedback window. If your provider's existing training plan for your learner is compliant with the older 4-week policy, then obviously it's going to be also compliant with the new policy too in terms of calendar months. This is just about providing a little bit more flexibility, but obviously you only need to do something if that flexibility is needed. Next slide, please.
Karen, can I just interrupt you just for a quick second? And to say we've had a couple of comments and a couple of questions coming through already. I can see those coming through. Can I just remind everybody that if you've got any questions for Laura, Karen or Kate, just to go and access the question box facility in the control panel and type the questions in there so that we can feed them back into the Q&A session. That'd be really helpful. Thank you. Sorry, Karen.
No problem. this is my last slide. So this is on training plans and progress reviews. So in the training plan section, we initially said the plan had to be agreed before any training was delivered, and a signed version of the plan had to be in place by the end of what we call a 42-day qualifying day period. Now, the 42 qualifying day period is basically if your learner then leaves within 42 days, no funding has been paid out for that learner from the public purse. That's all that is. Now, the reason we added this was because we've been told it was difficult to get all of the onboarding paperwork signed and in place before the programme actually started, so before the learning began. We also said in the initial version of the rules that the training plan had to detail the full volume of off-the-job hours that was going to be delivered for the full apprenticeship, with any content or narrative being added as that became available, especially for longer programmes. Now, we previously said for longer programmes that plans could be iterative, because we accept that, you know, if someone's on a 3-year programme, you probably don't know the full detail of everything they're going to do at the very beginning, and that comes obviously later, especially if options and things like that are included in the programme. But what was happening was that there were some training plans, you know, for example, for a 3-year programme, like I said, that only had the volume of hours as well as the content detail for the first year. But without the volume of hours for the full programme for the full 3 years, it meant we had no assurance that it was going to be an eligible programme, that was going to be enough hours to meet the minimum off-the-job threshold for the duration. So in terms of feedback on the training plan section, I think it's fair to say that the 42 days confused quite a lot of people. So I just want to clarify that if your provider's current process enables them to get a training plan agreed by you and the apprentice and the appropriate documentation signed and in place before your apprentice undertakes any learning, then they should just continue to do that. We're not suggesting that anything needs to change there, that they need to wait 42 days or do anything different to what they're doing now. The addition of the 42 days was a bit of a continuation from what I said earlier about initial assessment, that we recognise that some discussions with employers are now often virtual or via email rather than face-to-face. So in those cases, you might have agreed with your provider a training plan for your apprentice, and that might have been virtually on Teams, or you might have had a discussion via email, and your provider's obviously got email evidence of your agreement, but the 42 days is just really now giving them a little bit longer to get the actual documentation signed by you and in place and in the file. So it's just about adding a little bit of flexibility. If the provider doesn't need it, that's fine, they should just continue on as before. So like I said, this is just about flexibility where it's needed. And lastly for me, on progress reviews, previously in the 22-23 funding rules, we'd said that these progress reviews must happen every 12 weeks. And in drafting the initial rules, again, stakeholder feedback was saying that they felt that some programmes would benefit from an alternative frequency due to module length in some programmes. So we amended the policy slightly to say that reviews had to happen at least 4 times a year, carried out at 12 weekly interviews, unless, and this was the exception bit, unless there was an evidence delivery reason, such as module length, to adopt an alternative frequency. So for example, if your apprentice has undertaken a programme that's got 3 modules in any funding year, for example, then maybe 3 reviews rather than 4 reviews might be a better frequency. So they're reviewed at the end of every module rather than every 12 weeks, because that 12 weeks might fall in the middle of a module. It might not make sense to review it there. Progress reviews are an important part of the programme. So to manage it, we said that if an alternative frequency was adopted, like the 3 reviews that I've just given an example of, this had to be agreed with you as the employer. This wasn't something that the provider should, you know, put in place without having that conversation with you. And we also said, a bit like the initial assessment outcome conversation, if you weren't able to attend a progress review for whatever reason, you should be given the opportunity to contribute, you know, give some feedback about how you think your apprentice is doing, and then you must be sent the relevant information after the meeting for your review and signature. So that's keeping you in the loop. So whilst there are a few comments on the frequency change, I think on the whole, the feedback was really about whether the change would or could be applied retrospectively to existing learners. And like the change to active learning, we don't want to move the goalposts for things that have already been planned. So we've now said in version 1 that the frequency change will apply from the 1st of August for new starts and existing learners who are on programme at the 31st of July. So just to be clear, up till the 31st of July, if you've got a current apprentice in place, the provider should be putting in place progress reviews that comply with the previous approach of having a review every 12 weeks. And then from the 1st of August, if any added flexibility is needed, that can change from that date, for new starts obviously and for existing learners. But again, if everyone's comfortable with the existing approach of every 12 weeks and you don't need the added flexibility, then you don't need to make any changes in this area. So that's all for me, and I think I'm going to hand over to Kate now. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Karen. So I'm just going to cover a couple of areas of the funding rules. So in last year's funding rules, we added a rule around the use of secondments. So for the 23-24 funding rules, we've updated the date for those organisations who are operating as an employment agency or business. And by this, we mean they are adhering to the employment agency and business rules and guidance as published by Department for Business and Trade. So where an apprentice who remains on their main employer's PAYE scheme, where they will spend more than 50% of their apprenticeship duration on secondment or with another host employer, then these organisations can continue to take on apprenticeship starts up until the 31st of December 2023, and they can obviously support them until their completion. However, for starts on or after the 1st of January 2024, only organisations on the register of FlexiJob apprenticeship agencies will be permitted to start new apprenticeships which are delivered via a model whereby the apprentices are placed with host employers or seconded out for the majority of their apprenticeship. There are a couple of exceptions to this. So these are for those apprentices who are part of the NHS Workforce Sharing Agreement or secondment arrangements. And the other exception is for those apprentices who are seconded to an organisation, and that's because that organisation is part of a pooled PAYE scheme, so therefore they are unable to access the apprenticeship funding themselves. So to ensure that any organisations who deliver this model had the opportunity to join the FlexiJob Apprenticeship Agency Register, we did reopen the register for new applications in May. We undertook a wide comms campaign to ensure that all potential interested parties were contacted, and this included an email to all employers with an Apprenticeship Service account, as well as working with intermediary bodies to contact employment agencies and businesses. So for those organisations who applied at the last window, we're currently evaluating their applications, and successful applicants will join the FlexiJob Apprenticeship Agency Register at the beginning of October. Next slide, please. So we've merged the sections which covered additional payments for employers, providers, and the care leaver bursary into one section. So we're aware of the financial implications that care leavers can incur when moving into employment. So therefore, for any eligible apprentice that starts on or after the 1st of August 2023, they will receive a bursary of £3,000. And this will be paid in over 3 equal instalments as shown on the slide. So this will still be paid to the nominated training provider, and they must pass on the payments to the apprentice within 30 working days. So that part of it hasn't changed. So the care leaver bursary is a one-off claim. So an eligible apprentice must only receive the bursary once. And following feedback, we have removed the requirement from providers and apprentices to ensure that the apprentice has not received the bursary previously. And I just wanted to cover a couple more points regarding the care leaver bursary. So where an apprentice who is eligible to receive the bursary amount of £3,000 leaves their apprenticeship before receiving the full bursary amount, they will still be entitled to further payments on a new apprenticeship, and that's until they have received the £3,000 in total. And we've also been asked whether the bursary will have an impact on the apprentice's taxes or universal credit eligibility. So we've worked with HMRC to ensure that apprentices who are receiving the bursary will not lose income elsewhere. So it will not impact national insurance contributions or income tax and will be treated as capital for universal credit purposes, meaning it will not impact universal credit entitlements unless the apprentice's total savings exceed £6,000. So I'm now going to hand you back to Laura, who's going to cover the remaining slides.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to highlight some of the updates that we've made to the endpoint assessment section. And the first thing to say about this section is that it is under review, and that's because we need to reflect the changes that were announced in May this year about the new apprenticeship providers and assessment register, and the fact that from the 1st of August, apprenticeship providers will be responsible for choosing the endpoint assessment organisation for you as the employer, unless you as the employer wishes to continue to select in the EPAO for yourselves. So these updates will be made in a version 2 of the rules, with the timescale for the publication of that still to be confirmed. We also made a number of clarifications to the rules on endpoint assessment, and really we made those as a result of a number of queries that we received. So the first one is probably less pertinent for you as employers, but really it was about apprentices who have completed all of their training, they've reached the gateway, and then they've subsequently changed their employer prior to taking their endpoint assessment. So some of the queries that we've been getting, just for your information, highlight that the new job role that they've got doesn't necessarily relate to the apprenticeship that they were originally undertaking, and perhaps that new employer doesn't wish to sort of support them to complete their apprenticeship. But in principle, of course, we're clear that the right thing for that apprentice is that they should be able to undertake their endpoint assessment, and they should be able to achieve their apprenticeship if they so wish. So we are just working through various technical details around how that information can be reported to us by the training provider, and in particular, how the training provider can still claim a completion payment from us. Finally, for this section, we've also received some queries about an apprentice changing their endpoint assessment organisation once the endpoint assessment has commenced. And we've had some queries around whether that is actually possible and permissible. So we've clarified in the rules that this is possible, although obviously it will depend on the specific endpoint assessment requirements and the length, etc., of the endpoint assessment, and also the rationale for that change. So really the training provider will need to ensure that any withdrawal from the original endpoint assessment organisation is done in accordance with the contractual agreement between themselves and the endpoint assessment organisation. You as the employer would also have to obviously agree that, and indeed it might be yourselves that have requested that change in the first place. And also important to note that from a funding perspective, we will only pay up to the funding band maximum. So you as the employer, therefore, would need to be aware that you would be responsible for paying the difference in price if the sort of increase, if there was an increase in costs associated with changing the endpoint assessment organisation, and that took you over the funding band, you would be responsible for paying that difference. Just on breaks in learning, we have updated this section to reflect the policy change from active learning having to take place every 4 weeks to having to take place every calendar month. Karen covered this change in quite a lot of detail on her previous slides. But from a break in learning perspective, what we're saying here is that a break in learning must be used where there is no plan for active learning to take place during a calendar month. And as Karen alluded to before, where active learning was planned but didn't take place, for example, because the apprentice was off sick, then there's still no need to put them on a break in learning as long as some active learning does take place in the following calendar month. We've also clarified that a break in learning isn't required for those apprentices with a term time only contract during the month of August. So in these circumstances, it is accepted there'll be no learning planned or taking place during the month of August for term time only apprentices. But in this circumstance, a break in learning isn't required, and the provider would therefore still be paid as usual for that month. So finally, just moving on to our slide on next steps. I've already mentioned version 2 of the rules to reflect changes to endpoint assessment, and we may also make some further amendments to Annex A. We're also going to be updating our supporting materials, so for example the off-the-job training guide, the training plan and the change of circumstances guidance. This change of circumstances guidance used to be included in the funding rules, but we did take it out as part of our review because really it isn't rules as such. But we do understand that this information is helpful, so we're going to look to update it and publish it separately. We're also going to publish a summary document for employers, so for yourselves. This summary document is designed to have the key funding rules for you presented on a page, so you can see at a glance what you need to do, because we do appreciate that sometimes with your other commitments and sort of running your own businesses, etc., it can sometimes be difficult to go through the full funding rules document, particularly if you need to see quite quickly what your main responsibilities are. Finally then, our work on simplification continues. So that includes looking at reducing eligibility checks through data sharing with HMRC. And, you know, just to say the changes we've made for 23-24 have received positive feedback, but we still do welcome suggestions as to how we can go further. So we are still really keen to hear from you as to barriers that you might be facing in terms of taking on apprentices, issues that you face, particularly with any of the funding rules that we have, and any sort of solutions that we could put in place to address some of those. So if you have anything you'd like to feedback to us on that, you can pop it into the chat for the questions, or I think Nick will provide some contact details in a moment around how you can get any further feedback to us. So that's it from me, and I'll now hand back to Nick. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Karen and Kate as well for your inputs. That was really useful. Really good run through of the changes in the funding rules. So we'll have a look at some of the questions that have come in and try and get through as many of these as we can. Karen, the first question I've got is for you, and that's around sort of part-time apprentices or apprentices on 0-hour contracts and eligibility. Are they all eligible for apprenticeships?
Yeah, so part-time and those who are on a 0-hour contract have been eligible for apprenticeships for quite a long time now. I'd have to check back how many years, but it's definitely been in the funding rules for a number of years. But obviously, if the person is part-time on a 0 hours contract, their programme has to be extended, because the likelihood of them being able to do on average 6 hours training per week is going to be a lot less than a full-time apprentice. So the programme will need to adapt because of the part-time or 0 hour circumstances, but they are eligible.
Okay, cool. And then there's another question here that says, can a learner's previous accredited learning, and in this case they're talking about a mandatory course, be relevant, that's relevant to the role, be used as evidence for off-the-job training?
Well, it will depend if that mandatory course is part of the apprenticeship standard, because what we're funding is the apprenticeship standard. So if something's relevant to the role, but it's not included as part of the knowledge, skills and behaviours of the standard, then it can't be classed as off-the-job training, because the off-the-job training is about the standard. It's what we're paying the provider to deliver rather than something the employer might have done. So it really depends on the circumstances really to be able to answer that question, you know, very, very specifically. But, you know, if someone's got an actual example, they can obviously email that in.
Yeah, I think the best thing probably is with that one in particular, maybe raise that one with the support desk and get their take on it. So I think that will be quite good. Yeah, quite a good way forward for that. So one more for you, Karen, for the time being, and if you don't mind, there's a couple around off-the-job training. We'll try and cover 2 or 3 together. So there's one about learners completing earlier than planned, and then completing less off-the-job training as a result. But it still meets the minimum duration. Is a signed statement still required from the employer?
It is, because the purpose of the signed statement is really about where your provider has agreed with you at the beginning of the programme to deliver X amount of hours, say 500 hours, but they've only delivered 450. And really, if I was an employer, I'd want to know where the other 50 hours have gone. So that's what the purpose of the statement is. If somebody has completed earlier than planned, that might be, you know, with the same volume of training, because they might have been delivering more than 6 hours a week, for example, to be able to reduce that duration. If they have delivered less as well as delivering earlier, then they still do need the statement. Yeah.
And then whilst we're on off the job, so there's a question about, is there any change in wording around the 20% off the job requirement? And within that also there's a question about the requirements for the amount of off the job training in a calendar month. Can you pick up those 2 as well?
Yeah, so in terms of any changes to wording, read 20%, I think what the person there might be getting at is the change we made last August, where we introduced what we call a baseline. So previously, and still to be fair, the narrative around off the job is always the 20% policy. People always refer to it as 20% off the job learning. And that's what the policy was for an awful long time for every apprentice. So it was 20% of the apprentices' normal working hours, whatever those working hours might be. So 20% of 15 hours if that's what you work, 20% of 45 hours if that's what you work. And that's how much off-the-job training was required. Now, what we were finding was that we were finding a lot more apprentices than probably we initially envisaged were doing longer contracts, so 42 hours plus. And because of that, they were obviously doing more off-the-job training than we probably initially envisaged them doing. So last August, what we introduced, just in terms of the calculation, was we introduced a baseline, and that was 30 hours. So any full-time apprentice, their calculation is based on 20% of 30 hours now. Now, that doesn't mean that they can only work 30 hours. Obviously, if they're working for an employer for 40 hours, that's fine. But you know, in terms of the 20% calculation, it's based on a 30-hour volume now. So that was just to kind of to maybe, like, I suppose we thought people that were working longer contracts were being slightly disadvantaged in terms of the calculation. We wanted to sort of bring them a little bit closer together to everyone else. And the second question I think you asked was about what the requirement for the amount of off-the-job training was across the calendar month.
Yeah.
There isn't a minimum requirement, because we want to leave the programme as flexible as possible, and we want employers and providers together to discuss how the volume of hours, how the content of the training plan is going to be delivered that suits the business and suits the learner and the provider together as a kind of, you know, parties that are you know, in the apprenticeship. So we haven't imposed a minimum amount of off-the-job training, but it is obviously something that we look at when we do funding audits to make sure that people aren't just, you know, doing the minimum, you know, for a lot of months together. We do want to see obviously the plan being followed, and the plan is something that's been agreed with the employer. So there's no minimum, but it is something we constantly look at.
Okay, one more question about off the job, and then I'll leave you alone on that one. And that is classroom hours. Can that count towards off the job?
Yeah, so yeah, active learning really is off the job training in English and maths. Now, off the job training is a number of things. It can be provider activities, so it could be like tutor sessions at a college. It could be it could be assignments. There's a list of things in the funding rules that constitutes off the job training. It also includes activity that's being delivered by the employer if the activity is required for the apprenticeship. So again, it's a conversation between the provider and the employer about all of the activity that's needed and who's best placed to deliver it. But yeah, it can definitely include attendance at a provider.
Cool, thank you. Laura, question for you, and this is about who the funding rules applies to. So obviously, within funding rules as they're produced, we talk about funding rules being applicable to new starts from a particular date. So it's you know, so just can we confirm who the funding rules, which apprentices the funding rules apply to, or is it the same for all apprentices, irrespective of the year of their start date?
Yep. So generally speaking, the funding rules apply sort of on a yearly basis. So the funding rules that we're talking about today, the 2023-2024 funding rules, will apply to all new apprentice starts from the 1st of August 2023. And so anybody who started, for example, on the 1st of August 2022 up to the 31st of July 2023 would be on the previous year's set of funding rules. Sometimes, though, we determined that it would actually be better to apply some particular specific individual rules, what we call retrospectively. So we would say that the rule will apply to all new starts from the 1st of August, but a particular rule might also apply to people who started before that date. And in those circumstances, we will be clear in the funding rules that they also apply retrospectively as well.
Thank you very much. Faisal, an interesting question here. I don't think it relates to a change that we've mentioned, but it's worth exploring anyway. And that's around an apprentice who's working 50% in England on a hybrid model. And sometimes I think they're living in Wales, so there's an issue about when they're working at home, and if they're doing 2 days at home in Wales and 3 days in the office, is that okay? But if they flip that round and do 3 days in the office and 2 days working in England, are they still eligible? Can you just provide some clarity on that?
Thanks, Nick. So the rule is that the learner must spend at least 50% of their working hours in England over the duration of the apprenticeship. So yes, you can do alternate weeks as long as it allows the learner to spend the said 50% of their working hours in England over the duration of the apprenticeship. So as long as overall adds up to the 50%, it should be fine.
Brilliant. Thanks, Faisal. Karen, a question about how much detail is needed in the training plan. And there's a thing that one of the providers is simply adding in just the units that will be covered rather than individual tasks. And this is in a health and social care setting. Any comments on that one?
So in the funding rules, we say the minimum what the minimum requirements are. So we do actually say that it should have as a minimum a list of units if it's a qualification, and there should be a description of any additional activities that the apprentice will undertake to develop occupational competency. But I think really the training plan is meant to be used as a working document. You know, a learner or an employer should be able to pick it up and understand what that person's doing. So if the employer wants more detail, then I think that's a perfectly reasonable ask that they should make of their provider. If they want to see more detail, we don't require the sort of the nuts and bolts detail in terms of what's going to be done at every single session, for example. But you know, if that would be useful for the employer, then I think that's a conversation that they should definitely have.
Okay, thank you, Kate. The care leavers bursary. Is there anything more in terms that we could say in that, especially about who qualifies to receive the care leavers bursary?
Yeah, so basically any apprentices aged 16 to 24 years old who have been in the care of a UK local authority is eligible to get the care leaver bursary. So the funding rules go into a bit more detail, and I won't go through it all now, but basically a child in care is defined, and it's split into 3 categories. It's an eligible child, a relevant child, or a former relevant child. But really the key part is 16 to 24-year-olds who have been in the care of a UK local authority. But as I say, the section in the funding rules just provides a bit more background between the reference between eligible child, relevant child, and former relevant child.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Laura, some endpoint assessment questions, and quite a few about can endpoint assessments still go ahead if the apprentice leaves into quite a few different scenarios, actually. So there's one, I think, remaining in the same employer but a different job role that's not supported by the standard. There's one going into self-employment, and another with a different employer. Can you just shed some clarity on how endpoint assessment works when an apprentice leaves?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I think this goes back to one of the slides that I spoke about earlier, and one of the clarifications that we've made in this year's rules, which is to kind of say, really, if an apprentice has undertaken all of their training, they've reached their gateway, and they are ready to take endpoint assessment, but they haven't actually taken it yet. And we understand that there are a range of scenarios which could occur. One that we've had, I suppose, appear most frequently is this one about they've changed employer, and that new employer is kind of nothing to do with the apprenticeship. They don't want to support it, but can that apprentice still do their endpoint assessment? And I think we're really clear that, you know, in principle, yes, an apprentice absolutely should be able to undertake an endpoint assessment, because that's what's better for them. I hear the scenario as well about if they stay with the same employer but they move into a different job role. So I will take that on board and have a look at that one as well when we develop the guidance around all of this. But I think what we're trying to say is, in principle, yes, they should be able to take their endpoint assessment if they so wish, and if they've reached gateway. And what we're doing at the moment is just working through those various scenarios, and in particular putting some guidance together for training providers so that they can tell us about this, you know, about this change. And of course, as a training provider, they're particularly concerned as to how they claim their completion payment. So I think, to summarise, more information on that will come out.
Okay, cool, thank you. And then Kate, if I can throw one of you about the transfer levy cap. There's a comment there about monitoring of that can be really difficult with the reports and the tools available. Is there anything that you can shed a light on that?
Yeah, so we've obviously had quite a lot of feedback on the levy transfers improvements that we've made over the past year to 2 years. With regards to the finance page, we are looking at some more functionality, which hopefully will help, and that's going to hopefully be released within the next few months. So that's kind of a wait and see, but we do take on board the feedback that monitoring transfer spend can be difficult. So the team are currently looking to see what we can do to improve that on the service.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because we're running out of time. There's a question, Karen, where are we? It is about, lost that question. Let's pick up another one. Karen, if I can go through the 100% remote delivery by a provider, is that acceptable still now?
So we're having a lot of conversations about this at the minute. So it depends, kind of. I mean, by remote delivery, I assume you mean like online learning. So the only funding rule we've got is that it's self-directed online learning that's prohibited. So the apprenticeship can't be delivered fully in that way. And what we mean by that is the learner accessing things kind of at their own pace and time, and them deciding when to access things, and there being no kind of feedback loop or tutor support when they're accessing things. If you're talking about remote delivery as in virtual classrooms, as in, you know, the learner logs in and they're part of the classroom, the tutor's there, they're getting feedback, they can put their hand up and ask questions, that can be 100% delivered in that way. We have looked at like pros and cons of that, but really I suppose the benefit of allowing that to happen is where the provider is remote from where the learner and the employer are. So if your provider's at the other end of the country, you know, if we were to prohibit apprenticeships being delivered in that way, that might stop that kind of relationship happening, which we don't want to happen. But we are looking at kind of the quantities of kind of online delivery versus face-to-face at the moment.
Okay, and then one more question, then I'll move into the support slides. Can you extend an apprenticeship agreement or contract to allow time for course completion and endpoint assessment?
Yes, so the apprenticeship agreement should absolutely be extended. So if the programme isn't finishing when it should finish, so either because of a break in learning or the person's just taken a little bit longer than they thought, then everything needs to be updated in terms of when that person needs to finish. So the apprenticeship agreement needs to be updated with a new planned learning end date, as does the training plan. So absolutely those two documents should record the new information, have the most up-to-date information on them.
Okay, cool, thank you. Sorry guys, I've stolen a couple of extra minutes just to cover a few of those last questions to get through as many of them as we can. Can we move on to the next slide, Jazz? Excellent. So if you want more information about the Apprenticeship Service in general, so this is the bit where we cover some of the support that's available for you. So if you want any more information about Apprenticeship Service in general, or you want to go back to listen to some of our previous webinars, You can look out for our Department for Education YouTube channel at Education.gov.uk, and on there we've got 3 playlists. One is around support videos covering the different functions of the Apprenticeship Service, and that's the Using the Apprenticeship Service playlist. We've then got the webinar recordings playlist, where we keep recordings of our webinars like today's on there, and we've also then got some miscellaneous videos on an apprenticeship support video playlist. We add more stuff onto that channel all the time, so please go and have a look at that, and subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to get alerts when new content is uploaded. And today's webinar will be on that playlist within about the next 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, move on to the next slide. Just wanted to let you know about the Top 100 Apprenticeship Employers event. The Top 100 Apprentice Employers are going to be announced during a special live broadcast that's going to take place towards the end of the month on the 29th. I think it's at 2 o'clock. And the broadcast will give you a countdown of all the different 2023 rankings, and it will give insights into the characteristics of top employers, and interviews with some of the representatives from those employers that have made it into that list. And if you haven't entered, it's worth going on to have a look at, to listen. It's a great opportunity to get an insight from other employers to help benchmark yourself against some of those other employers that have put themselves forward for the award. And then also in terms of the National Apprenticeship Awards, they're celebrating their 20th anniversary this year, which is phenomenal. And the application for that is now open. It's available, and you've got until the 30th of June to apply. And all entries have got to be made through the appawards.co.uk website. There's one award which is the ESFA Apprenticeship Development Partner Award, and that's got a slightly longer deadline, but you still do that through the App Awards website. So there are 3 employer categories based on employer headcount. There's a social justice category, the Apprentice Development Partner one with ESFA that I mentioned, a Rising Star for an apprentice award, and there are then 3 learner awards based on the level of apprenticeships that apprentices are completing, and then finally there's an Apprenticeship Champion Award. So please do, if you've got any nominations, please go on to appawards.co.uk and make those suggestions and those nominations. Okay, the final slide, if I can. On this slide, I've put lots of the links to some of the documents that have been referred to today, and some good places to go for additional support. And if you go to the control panel now, you'll find a section called Handouts. There should be a PDF document in there that you can download, which has got the details of these links on there, so you don't have to scribble them down whilst they're on screen. But on the so some of the links that we've got links to apprenticeships.gov.uk. That's a great place for information about both apprenticeships and the Apprenticeship Service. Have a look at that. To register for future webinars, follow the link that's on the screen there, and then by the end of this week we'll also have an on-demand recording available of today's webinar, and the one that we ran yesterday for training providers. Those webinars, those recordings will be available for about 4 to 6 weeks, so you can go and listen back to what we talked about today for about 4 to 6 weeks, and that just gives us a bit of time, a bit of breathing space, so that we can edit the proper recording to go on to YouTube at a later date. So the more permanent recording will go onto YouTube. We've also got the links to both the funding rules document and the summary of changes document on there as well, so you can go and access that and read that at your leisure. And then finally, if you've got any questions about the Apprenticeship Service, any specific queries about the service, then use the self-service support tool, or email the support desk, and the details are on the slide as well. Okay, that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for sticking out right to the end. And also I'd like to thank the presenters today for their inputs and their insights. It was really useful. And then as you leave, can I just ask you, please complete the short survey and give us your feedback. And then I'll just say goodbye, everybody, and thanks for the rest. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, bye.